January 22nd, 1879. A messenger arrived at a small British supply post in South Africa. He was riding hard, barely coherent. His message was simple and devastating. The main British force, over 1,300 men, had just been annihilated at a place called Isandlwana. Wiped out, in hours, by a Zulu army. And that same Zulu army, over 4,000 warriors, was now marching directly toward the post where he stood. The post was called Rorke's Drift. It was defended by approximately 150 British soldiers. Many of them were sick. Some couldn't even walk. They had one wall of mealie bags and biscuit tins between themselves and 4,000 of the finest warriors on the African continent. What happened next would produce more Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest military honor, than any single engagement in the history of the British Army. This is the Battle of Rorke's Drift. To understand Rorke's Drift, you need to understand what was happening in South Africa in January 1879. The British Empire was in the process of attempting to consolidate control over southern Africa, specifically trying to force the independent Zulu kingdom into a confederation under British authority. The Zulu kingdom was not a collection of scattered villages. It was a highly organized, militarily sophisticated nation with a standing army of warriors, the Amazulu, that had been trained and disciplined for generations. Their king, Cetshwayo Kampande, had no interest in submitting to British authority. When the British issued an ultimatum demanding the Zulu disband their army, knowing it would be refused, it was effectively a declaration of war. The British commander, Lord Chelmsford, was confident, perhaps too confident. He divided his forces into 3 columns and advanced into Zulu territory, expecting relatively easy resistance from warriors armed largely with spears against soldiers with rifles. He was about to make one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in British military history. On January 22, 1879, Lord Chelmsford made a fatal error. He divided his force again, taking half his men on a scouting mission, leaving approximately 1,300 soldiers at his camp at Isandlwana. What he didn't know was that a Zulu army of over 20,000 warriors had been shadowing his column for days. The Battle of Isandlwana lasted just a few hours. The Zulu used their classic formation, the chest and horns, a pincer movement that enveloped the British camp from 3 sides simultaneously. The British soldiers fought hard. They ran out of ammunition. The camp was overrun. Over 1,300 men, soldiers and camp followers, were killed. It remains one of the worst defeats ever suffered by the British Army against an indigenous force. And as the survivors fled, some of the Zulu force broke away. They were heading for Rorke's Drift.
They're closing in on us!
We can't stop!
And when the messenger arrived at Rorke's Drift with news of Isandlwana, the 2 officers in command faced an impossible choice. Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers and Lieutenant Chard Bromhead of the 24th Regiment of Foot. Neither was a senior or particularly celebrated officer. Chard was there to supervise a pontoon bridge. Bromhead was considered by some superiors to be slow and partially deaf. History had different plans for both of them. They had perhaps 30 minutes to decide, run or fight. Running meant crossing open ground with sick men who couldn't keep pace, with 4,000 warriors closing fast behind them. The math was brutal. They decided to fight. In those precious minutes, they transformed the small mission station, a storehouse and a hospital, into a defensive perimeter using whatever they could find. Mealie bags, large sacks of grain, stacked into walls. Biscuit tins filled with earth for weight. Wagons overturned and lashed together. It was not much of a fortress, but it was all they had. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the Zulu force appeared on the ridge above Rorke's Drift. Every British soldier who saw them understood immediately what they were facing. The Zulu came in their thousands, a line of warriors stretching across the hillside, moving with the disciplined speed of a professional army. They attacked immediately. The fighting was savage from the first moment. The British defenders fired volley after volley into the advancing warriors, the Martini Henry rifles giving them a significant advantage at range. But the Zulus pressed forward regardless of their losses, closing the distance until the fighting became hand-to-hand at the walls. Men fought with rifle butts, with bayonets, with bare hands, and through all of it, the hospital was burning. One of the most extraordinary moments of the entire battle happened inside that burning building. Private Henry Hook, a man who had been described by his own officers as lazy and troublesome, found himself alone in a smoke-filled burning hospital ward with patients who could not walk. He fought off Zulu warriors who were breaking through the walls room by room, holding a doorway with a bayonet while simultaneously pulling sick men through a hole he had smashed in the wall, handing them to safety one by one. Hook alone was responsible for saving the lives of multiple men who would otherwise have burned or been killed. He would later receive the Victoria Cross, but he was not alone in his heroism. Corporal William Allen and Private Frederick Hitch, both seriously wounded, refused to leave their posts. Private John Williams smashed through wall after wall of the burning hospital with a pickaxe, creating escape routes for patients while Zulu warriors were in the next room. Surgeon James Reynolds moved between wounded men under constant fire, treating injuries without cover, his composure described by survivors as almost supernatural. And through the night, the attacks kept coming. 6 major assaults in total, each one repelled. At around 4 a.m., after more than 10 hours of fighting, the attack stopped. The Zulu force withdrew. When dawn came and the British soldiers looked out from their walls, they saw what they had survived. The ground around Rorke's Drift was covered with the bodies of Zulu warriors. Estimates of Zulu dead range from 350 to over 600. 17 British soldiers had been killed. Of the 150 defenders, over 100 had been wounded. They had held. Later that morning, as survivors were still processing what had happened, the Zulu force reappeared on the ridge above. Every British defender who saw them prepared to fight again. But the Zulus did not attack. They stood on the ridge, looking down at what remained of Rorke's Drift. And then they turned and walked away. In the aftermath, 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded to the defenders of Rorke's Drift, the most ever given for a single engagement in British military history. Chard and Bromhead, the 2 unremarkable officers who had chosen to fight, were both promoted and decorated. Private Henry Hook, the lazy troublemaker, was celebrated as a national hero. King Charles himself received the survivors. And the Zulu warriors who fought that night, let it be said clearly, were not savages or a mindless horde. They were skilled, courageous, disciplined soldiers fighting for their kingdom's independence against an empire that had given them no choice but war. The true tragedy of Rorke's Drift is that it was a battle that should never have happened. 150 men, one night, one wall of grain sacks and biscuit tins, against 4,000 warriors, 11 Victoria Crosses, the most ever awarded for a single battle in British history. But the number that stays with me is not the 4,000 or the 150 or even the 11. It's the private in a burning building, smashing through walls with a pickaxe, dragging sick men to safety one by one, while the enemy was in the next room. That is what Rorke's drift really was. Not a statistic, not a record. Just human beings on both sides doing extraordinary things in the worst night of their lives. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe for more untold military history every week. And let me know in the comments, which Victoria Cross story from this battle surprised you most? I'll see you in the next one.